My name is Candice Ward. Welcome to this webinar. I am the CDEP lead, but I'm wearing two hats in this webinar. I also am CamDiab's training and outreach manager and have had many years of working with type 1 diabetes and technology, and I'm very familiar with the CamAPS FX system, so I will be sharing the content presentation with my colleague Sara. Just as starting off, I'm going to act as your chair and just run through some housekeeping. Please say hi in the chat functionality. Great. Thank you very much for everyone who's saying hi already. But the questions will only be answered in the Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will answer the questions at the end of the session. If we do not get to your question, we can also contact you afterwards. But we will try cover all questions in the Q&A at the end. So please do use that function and ask as we go along, but please say hello in the chat. If you should have any technical issues, you may want to just leave and join again, or you can reach out to Sue, who's the CDEP admin, via the chat to ask for help. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared afterwards, so if you do have to dip off because clinic is calling, you can watch it later. And we will be providing certificates of attendance and a copy of the slide deck. So you will be getting that email probably early next week, so don't worry, the information will come to you. Right, I am going to hand over to Will soon to start the presentation, but just to remind you of what we're going to cover, Will from ATUK is giving us a little insight into the Dana insulin pump, which is compatible with CamAPS system. And then Sara and I will be sharing about a quick brief insight into how the algorithm works and its features, but then really focusing on the practical tips of pregnancy planning throughout the pregnancy and in the post-delivery to cover those important bits. Right, so I'm going to hand over to Will. Will, please introduce yourself and take us through your slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. Well, my name, as you can see from the slide, is Will Murray. I'm the Territory Manager for ATUK in the southeast of England and London. And I'm very pleased to be able to share with you this information today about the Dana pump and a little bit on CamAPS. So, my employer, I work for Advanced Therapeutics. We're the distributor for the Dana pump. We don't actually make the pump, and the manufacturer of the pump is a company called Suil, which is based in South Korea. And you can see from the slides that they've been making pumps there for over 40 years. It was set up by a doctor called Subong Choi, who's currently a professor of pediatrics in Korea. Still heavily involved with the company, and the latest pump available in the UK is there on the bottom right hand corner, the Dana I pump. So why would people choose a Dana pump? Well, there are lots of different reasons, and I would say more recently it's clinical evidence that's driving the uptake, and that's largely because of CamAPS, because of all the clinical studies that have been done showing it to be a very effective, very good at doing its job. Something else that we try to stress that shouldn't be underrated is the discretion that being able to manage the pump from a mobile phone can bring. People don't actually have to get the pump out when using CamAPS. They can bolus from the pump and do other things on the app that can help them manage their pump while it's tucked away in underwear or pockets or wherever they keep it. I've got a little bit more to say about accuracy of delivery. There's a slide later on, I'll talk about that. And when we use the word interoperability, we just simply mean that it connects to different apps. But the focus of today is obviously CamAPS FX, the hybrid closed loop system. But we also have an app called the Dana app. So for anyone who doesn't have access to CamAPS or decides they don't want to use CamAPS, they can still manage their pump fully from a mobile phone. They can give a bolus, deliver a bolus comfortably from the phone, use a temporary basal rate, set it up, or change settings. So moving on, just a few things, important things to remember about the Dana I insulin pump. Obviously, we're very proud of the fact that it was used predominantly, the vast majority of studies over the last 10 or 15 years were using Dana pumps with CamAPS. licensed from 1 year old up to over 60s, and obviously the focus for today is pregnancy. And uniquely, the algorithm is the only licensed algorithm in pregnancy. So I did mention accuracy earlier, and at the back, you may never actually read the information at the back of a user guide, but all the companies put all the technical stuff at the back of their user guides, and accuracy is listed there as well. And we're very pleased that the Dana pump is the most accurate pump, looking at that information. The error is around plus or minus 4% at these tiny, tiny little doses. And why is that important? I've just put up a couple of quotes from studies carried out by experts. If I can just let you read through those two statements. And I think the message is that please don't assume that all pumps are the same, because they are quite different. If you're delivering a large dose of maybe 10 or 15 units of insulin, they're all pretty much the same. They're all as accurate as each other. But with an algorithm like CamAPS, where it's delivering insulin every 8 to 12 minutes or so, the amounts of insulin are minuscule, tiny, tiny little amounts. So with the Dana pump at plus or minus 4%, it's delivering pretty much what it's been asked to deliver. Where there are other pumps out there where the error can be as high as 20 or 30%. And thinking about that, translating that in from a theoretical point of view, this is CamAPS represented here with the phone, the Dexcom, and the Dana pump. And I guess the jury's still out on whether the CamAPS is the most sophisticated algorithm, but it's certainly proven its worth with all the research that's been written and published in good studies. So you're using a very, very top range algorithm. From a sensor point of view, you want something that's accurate and reliable, and Dexcom has certainly proven that over the years. And similarly, you want a pump to do the job that it's been asked to do, so it's accurate. The Dana pump was built to be a looping pump, an interoperable looping pump. And the results from the studies with CamAPS were using that trio of technology. And we're proud to be a part of that. So moving on to some practical aspects, the Dana pump, it has a 300 unit reservoir, and all of you probably know that during pregnancy, the requirements can go up quite a lot, sometimes 2 to 3 times what the pre-pregnancy levels were. And if somebody gets a bug, a cold, or a virus, that can go even higher. So from a practical point of view, because the pump does hold 300 units, they're going to be changing it less frequently than other systems. And it is a self-fill cartridge. And what does that mean? Well, you can put different insulins in it. The manufacturer Suil, they've only officially tested Humalog and NovoRapid, but they know globally that Fiasp and Lyumjev are used without any known issues. And if you haven't seen this document, I would suggest you Google it, because you can download this NHSC comparison chart from the website. And it's a very useful tool, and they call it a tool for patients to help them decide their diabetes technology. It's not just about HCL systems. It talks about smart pens and all sorts of other things. But the reason I'm mentioning it here is that it shows that Dana and CamAPS is compatible with any rapid, but also ultra-rapid acting insulin. And why might that be important? If I can just share with you details from one article, excuse me, where they were reviewing 2 studies looking at the effects of the rapid and ultra-rapid acting insulins on postprandial control. And a little bit more about the outline of the study is shown here. So it was a retrospective secondary analysis of 2 double-blind studies, and the endpoints were specifically 2 hours and 4 hours, the incremental area under the curve, the time in range at 4 hours, and the time above and below the range, which was 3.9 to 10 millimoles. And the HCL system that they used in the study was CamAPS, Dana insulin pumps, and the Dexcom G6. So what did they find? The main observation was that excuse me, with Lyumjev, they got clinically significant improvements in time and range at breakfast and evening meal. So you can see the actual values there, 6.7 and 5.7% increase in time and range respectively, which were regarded as being clinically significant. And the authors did comment that just by changing the insulin, you could get a clinically significant improvement in time and range. Fiasp, it was proven to be safe, but didn't actually offer the same advantages as Lyumjev when compared with Novorapid. So in summary, the authors just concluded that with using Lyumjev, you can get improved postprandial control with compared to Humalog. So that little extra bit of nudge in time and range when you're trying to do your best, certainly during pregnancy. As far as thinking again about pregnancy, when the boluses can be 20 or 30 units, the Dana pump delivers the insulin quite slowly. The fastest it goes in is 5 units per minute, but it can be slowed down to 2 or 1. So those particularly large boluses, the patient has the option of 3 different delivery speeds, which could help with comfort to reduce pain or discomfort during the bolus delivery, less risk of a leak at the cannula site, and certainly a less risk of occlusions. And all of that can be done via the CamAPS app. And moving on to pricing, the Dana CamAPS is available through the NHS supply chain as part of the new technology framework. And you can see from the information on the slide, a Dana pump with 4 years access to CamAPS costs £2,750. And the consumables typically would be between £1,500 and £1,600 per year. And if there is a situation where someone can't access Dana CamAPS because they don't have access to a phone, we will provide a phone free of charge. And if you have an existing Dana patient, then they can start using CamAPS on an annual basis. You can get a license through the supply chain. It will only cost £175 for the year. So in summary, hopefully that's given you a flavour of what Dana pump is all about when working with CamAPS. The CamAPS was developed using predominantly Dana pumps. We've got unrivaled accuracy, a very large cartridge of 300 units, so they don't have to change it so often, and a slow delivery speed that will hopefully help with the comfort of pain during delivery and certainly reduce the risk of occlusions. So that's my bit done for you today. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Will. Really appreciate your input. So we're going to move on to the pregnancy side of things. And I want to hand over to Sara at this point so that Sara can introduce yourself and take us through what we're going to cover next. Thanks, Sara.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Candice. Thanks, Will. So yeah, my name's Sara Hartnell. My background is I'm a diabetes educator, worked for many years at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. I worked with the artificial pancreas research team in Cambridge, helped with the research and development of the CamAPS FX algorithm, and was involved in most of the training and onboarding for participants in the ATUK study. And I now work full-time as Operations and Partnerships Manager for CamDiab. So I'm going to take you through just a really brief refresh of the system. Candice is then, we're going to interchange, and Candice is going to go through personalization. I'll then go through the use in pregnancy, and then we've got some case studies to just go through some optimization. Just before we start, I'm just going to let you know, I'm not, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the outcome of the ADAP study. I'm assuming the majority of people will be familiar with that data if you work in diabetes in pregnancy. We're obviously really thrilled with the trial results. They showed an increase in over 10% time in range in the pregnancy target range compared to usual care in CGM. And with a reduction in A1C, a reduction in overnight hypos. Interestingly, also a 3.7 kilo less weight gain compared to usual care, and importantly, also reduction in large for gestational age babies. And there's a really nice webinar that you can see on the CDEP website of Professor Helen Murphy, who was PI for the study, going through all the clinical data from that study there if you want to go back and have a look at that. So I'm not going to go through all that again. In terms of the medical indication, the system's licensed for use in type 1 diabetes from the age 1 year and up, obviously including pregnancy, wide weight range there up to 300 kilos, and a wide total daily dose up to 350 units a day. The CamAPS FX algorithm itself, the app houses the hybrid Cambridge model predictive control algorithm, and the app itself acts as the CGM receiver. So you see all the glucose data coming through with all the standard customizable alerts that you'd expect from Dexcom G6. It incorporates the bolus calculator, and it's important to know you can use the bolus calculator in open or closed loop. So if someone is out of auto mode while they're changing their sensor, for example, that's fine. You can still use the bolus calculator in the app to deliver a bolus. You don't need to do it direct from the pump. Data automatically uploads to Gluco. There is also, if people prefer or don't have access to Gluco, 2-week PDF report that you can generate from the statistics menu. And the system offers real-time SMS alerts for guardians, carers, and the ability to monitor via the CamAPS companion, which it offers a loved one the opportunity to kind of see the sort of exact mirror image of what the user sees on their screen if they link to their account. So the system works, and I think it's we're all having to remember how all different systems work, and they're all slightly different. So this system works by setting the pump basal rate to 0. It provides then an extended bolus every 8 to 12 minutes that the app instructs. And the system still is a hybrid closed loop system, to meaning that we obviously still need to be providing, announcing meal boluses, providing insulin for carbohydrates up front. It's super easy to set up, so just takes the weight and total daily dose. The preset pump settings aren't used by the algorithm at all in the automated insulin delivery calculations, but it's also obviously important that they're there and set accurately. So if the system reverts to open loop, then the pump will revert to those preset pump basal rates to make sure that there's always insulin available to the person. The system is highly adaptive. It's constantly predicting and adapting and learning, and it's taking into account the daily insulin needs, the day-to-day insulin variability and needs. If someone has higher requirements, is more resistant at certain times of day, it will start to learn that, and it will take into account as well. There's a postprandial function, so it looks to support the user in delivering additional or delivering less insulin after a meal bolus goes in. So there's a constant feedback. It takes the CGM data, it learns the insulin sensitivity, and it's taking into account the insulin boluses and the meal information that's coming from the system. It's looking to take on into account carbohydrate on board. It predicts future glucose levels, and it's constantly feeding back in that loop to optimize insulin infusion. So that CGM data is received every 5 minutes from a Dexcom G6, and the algorithm adjusts the insulin delivery every 8 to 12 minutes in that continual loop. So I'm going to hand over to Candice, who's going to talk you through the sort of levers we have to personalize this system.
Thanks, Sara. So the system or the algorithm is super complicated, super sophisticated to really support that ever-changing needs of a woman who is pregnant. And we've designed it that it takes the hard work. There are only a few levers that you can optimize. The first is your personal glucose target, and the next is your insulin to carb ratio. Because if your insulin to carb ratio isn't optimized, then the algorithm will either have to, if it's too much, the algorithm's going to have to save the hypos. If it's too weak, then the algorithm is going to have to deal with more carbohydrate than the speed of insulin sort of allows for. And so you'll get hypo or hyperglycemia. The personal glucose target is the target the algorithm is aiming for. There is another target in the bolus calculator, but that is just if you're using corrections via the bolus calculator. That does not influence what the algorithm is aiming for. So these are the two settings we'll be concentrating on to optimize. And then you have two features called boost and ease off that are equivalent to very sophisticated increased or decreased temporary basal rates to roll with the punches life is throwing at you. So let's just remind ourselves, for personal glucose target, the preset or default personal glucose target is 5.8. And that sort of came across from all the wider studies that we've done, that 5.8 was an optimal setting to place. But we can go as low as 4.4 and as high as 11. The under 5 settings are there specifically for pregnancy, which is one of the reasons why this system is licensed and has that clinical evidence, is because we have that lower personal glucose target that can drive that tight control. And just remembering from all the studies, this is from the pivotal study, Tauschman and co., that often we need lower personal glucose targets at night and slightly higher personal glucose targets during the day. That's because algorithms are very good at getting tight control without increased risks of hypos during the night while the person is sleeping. But during the day, it's a little bit more difficult because there's bolusing, stress, activity, and so forth. So often when we're setting that personal glucose target, we need to have these graphs in mind, maybe using a slightly higher target during the day and less for while the person is sleeping. Ease off, so it relaxes the algorithm, reduces the amount of insulin on board, stops insulin delivery earlier, and is aiming for a temporarily a slightly higher target while you've got ease off on. And it's really a function used for activity, used if somebody is having recurrent hypos or drinking alcohol, hopefully not while they're pregnant, but it just relaxes the algorithm for that odd time. So it's not a function that we should be using every day. It's just for that walk or that gym class or activity that's going on. Boost is the opposite and makes the system more aggressive to be able to correct glucose levels quicker, but it also is sort of a safer option to correct glucose than adding in manual corrections, which you are able to do via the bolus calculator. But Boost will stop boosting if it predicts glucose targets are going to come in range with the amount of insulin on board. So it's much a safer option to prevent that rebound hypoglycemia. And we will be discussing how we use Ease Off and Boost specifically in pregnancy in this session. We use Boost predominantly slightly differently in pregnancy than outside pregnancy. Both these functions change the way the algorithm is learning, and so we encourage people not to overuse these functions, but to use them when it is appropriate. Doesn't mean the algorithm's not learning at all, but that nuanced learning isn't happening as much. But it is important that people do use them when they need to. Then people often ask us, so what settings do we have to optimize outside, the personalization of the ICR and the personal glucose target for that individual? And total daily dose is something that has to sometimes be adapted in some of the other systems, and it is not necessary for total daily dose to be adjusted in CamAPS. You put it in once when you start the system and never need to put it in again. The system automatically adjusts the total daily dose for itself around midnight, and that is part of that, so it's always adapted. The total daily dose is also part of the safety envelope that prevents the algorithm from delivering too much insulin. And so if you see the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see glucose levels rising. The algorithm is working very hard, but you can see it almost tops out. That's the total daily dose safety sort of kicking in, saying the algorithm cannot deliver more insulin than this. And it's often a sign that the set is not working. There's set failure, the huge amount of insulin is being delivered. The algorithm has calculated it's unsafe to deliver anything further. And so it's really important when you see this to be hot on thinking about infusion set failure and changing the set to deliver insulin into the system. Weight adjustments. So total daily dose and weight is put in at the beginning, but we would recommend that weight is optimized from time to time, and especially in pregnancy, because the weight really helps in the postprandial period and allowing the algorithm to really know the insulin relationship to carbohydrate and its understanding of its role in the postprandial period. Outside pregnancy, adapted every 6 to 12 months for adults or every 3 months in children. But we would recommend that the weight is updated every time the woman is seen. So every around 4 weeks, just so that the algorithm has the best chance of getting that postprandial glucose target. Okay, basal. As we said, the pump basal is not used as part of the algorithm. It is, however, the safety fallback for times of open loop, for example, the 2-hour sensor warm-up. And we would hate somebody to sort of lose a margin of their management because the pump basal isn't holding them during that 2-hour time. So we would, every time we see people in pregnancy, we would just look at the pump basal. What is it programmed at? And, you know, what happens in times of open loop? Does the basal hold them, or is there a drift up or down? And just keep optimizing the basal rate every time we see a woman in pregnancy clinic, just to make sure that it is a safe setting. People often ask us, so how do we do this? If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, this is from gluco. You can see total daily dose is sort of 107 units a day. This is not a pregnant example. You can see this person isn't a great boluser, which isn't ideal. So there's a small amount of bolus insulin, a huge amount of algorithm insulin. And if we put in, you know, equate the pump basal to 92 units a day, it'll be too strong for that individual because the algorithm is covering a larger amount of carbohydrate than maybe it should be. So we would just go back to our clinical data and look at that, you know, total daily dose, and maybe 50% of that would be equated more or less what that woman's requirements are, and then just using your clinical acumen to check that out. But do not take the algorithm delivered insulin, because it's significantly helping in the postprandial stage, even if the person is bolusing accurately. Carbohydrate counting is still important. We know that to really hit that tight 7.8 within an hour, the insulins available to us on the market, even the ultra rapids, are just not fast enough to manage that peak. So it is important that, you know, when women ask us, what can I do to help out? It's around, you know, counting your carbs, maybe making choices around lower GI. You know, how can I slow down this meal to support that target? And especially starting to think about spreading out the carbohydrate throughout the day, little and often. We're not saying they should be on low carbohydrate diets. That's not great for mum and babe, but that there's small, frequent meals throughout the day, which will also help in early pregnancy when they're feeling sort of morning sick, and in later pregnancy when the baby's squashing the tummy. That is really important, that it's really great to try have small, frequent meals throughout the day. The algorithm can help significantly, but it is not going to be able to cope with a huge amount of high glycemic index food. Meal bolusing is probably one of the key things, but it is one of the most tricky things when you're busy, you know, with a career, with younger children, to get that bolusing amount time. But if we can try get pre-meal insulin in, ideally starting 10 to 15 minutes before. We will talk about in the different phases of pregnancy what we would suggest, but ideally pre-meal bolusing is something that is helpful. If the bolus is late, you often get, as in this graph, this is from the PDF report. If you haven't seen it, you can see this person has eaten early, got alarms, they've put on boost, which is the red at the bottom. The algorithm's helping out. They've then done correction, maybe some more fake carbs, and ended up very hypoglycemic a few hours later because of this mismatch of managing that. If mistakes do happen, we would prefer people to try respond as quickly as possible. So remember as quickly as possible, but not give a full bolus very late. So, you know, within an hour, depends on the individual. You know, you could start at about half the bolus that people should have given, they can give, just to stop that sting in the tail and prevent that. If it's much longer, then just use boost. But we would encourage people to try at least not give the bolus late, if possible. Some people also ask us, so what happens, you're supposed to give the bolus 10 to 15 minutes before eating, but what if I'm low? Not hypo, what if I'm low? Do I give the bolus at the end of the meal? What do I do? So we would recommend that if they're low, so not hypo, but on the low side, that they bolus the full amount of insulin for the carbohydrate they're consuming and eat. Do not wait the 10 or 15 minutes. The algorithm will already have been trying to put the brakes on, shut off insulin delivery earlier. So if they under bolus or if they bolus late, they're going to cause this mismatch that you can see. Person ate and then bolus later and ended up hypo again. If somebody is hypo, we would encourage them to fully hypo treat. So rescue treatment, wait until they're above targets with 2 hours up, and then again bolus and eat like they did, as if they were just sort of on the low side of target but not hypo. And this will just really help prevent the repercussions that happen later on to go forward. The other thing we need to watch out for is bolusing too early. Some people, because they see high glucose levels, will often push the bolus earlier and earlier. And some people are bolusing 20, 30, 40 minutes ahead because they're seeing hyperglycemia after the meal. It's really keen to look at what is the right timing for that person, for their diet and their time of pregnancy. So if you're seeing these V's, so the bolus goes in and then there's a drop in glucose before the rise happens, that might indicate that that bolus is being given too early. The insulin is already starting to act on glucose levels before the impact of that meal. And so the algorithm sees this drop. If you look at the bottom line, you can see in the purple, as soon as glucose starts dropping, the algorithm pulls back to stop the hypo, but they're not then there to support that postprandial period. And so you still end up high, which then the algorithm has to catch. So it's that mismatch, the right timing with the right support from the algorithm. And it's important not to give that bolus too early. So not too late, not too early. Sounds like Goldilocks, just right. And then the insulin to carb ratio. People often ask us, what does a good insulin to carbohydrate ratio look like when I'm trying to optimize? So here we go. This is if the insulin to carb ratio is too weak on a pattern mechanism. You can obviously see the high glucose levels after the meal, but you can see where the bolus went in. The timing looks okay. The algorithm starts working after the bolus, but you can see it's working really hard and despite the high glucose levels. So this would be an indication that actually the upfront insulin needs to be a little bit more aggressive to match with the algorithm support. What is too strong? So this is, again, we've still got high glucose levels post-meal, but you can see at the bottom in the purple line, the algorithm is hardly working. It's just delivering its patency pulses every 90 minutes. Those patency pulses are one click of the pump, 0.04 units, and it's just to keep the pressure in the infusion line up so it doesn't block. And so it's literally doing no work at all. That person is running on completely on bolus insulin, and we would need to weaken that to allow that match combination of the bolus and the algorithm working in partnership. This next one is slightly more subtle. It's still a slightly too strong an insulin ratio. And you can see when the bolus goes in, glucose levels start dropping. The algorithm is still pulling back, and then it has to catch it later. And often if it has to catch it later, you get sort of that rebound high and then back down again. So it's trying to find the middle ground where the algorithm isn't working too hard after the meal or not at all, to get that balance in the insulin to carb ratio. We also have a function called add meal. Now, add meal is separate from the bolus calculator. And when people use the add meal is when they want to announce carbohydrate, but not deliver a bolus for that carbohydrate. So they go into the add meal function and put that amount in, and then choose one of three options. The first one is hypo treatment. So they're announcing that hypo treatment that automatically softens the algorithm for the next little while to help reduce the risk of sort of rebound hypos. It's great for education because then you know how much carbohydrate is being put in. Let's see, if you put in 20 grams of carbs, can we see we're rebounding too high? Maybe we need to tweak that. And people might need different amount of carbohydrate at night when they just go low, but then fall back asleep, then during the day when they're still active. So it's a really useful function that we encourage everyone to do if they can do after they've treated the hypo, to go in and announce the hypo treatment in add meal and tap on hypoglycemia. The other two can be quite useful. So this meal or snack is announcing a small amount of carbohydrate that you don't want to bolus for. For example, if you're going for a walk and your glucose is slightly on this low side and you just want to sort of top yourself up, but it's announcing to the algorithm so it has an idea that if that might be too much, that it knows, because at any one time when it's doing its 8 to 12-minute calculation, it's taking into account the current insulin on board, the current glucose levels and trends, and the current carbohydrate on board. But it's small amounts, I would say under 20 grams for the adult population. It can also be if somebody wants to they're not quite sure, they're feeling a bit sick in the morning, I'll eat at least half of that, they could put the other half in the add meal. But it's not designed to replace bolusing. Insulin just delivered via the algorithm is not quick enough to fully cover and be a fully closed loop system. The slowly absorbed meal is the last function. That helps the system with high fat, high protein meals that come with a large amount of carbohydrate, our big pizzas and so forth. And it's a way of splitting the boluses. What we would recommend during pregnancy is probably avoiding this function. Going back to the choice of carbohydrates, how much carbohydrate you eat at any one time, we would, rather than having 100 grams of carbohydrate via pizza at any one time, and then still expecting to get optimal post-meal glucose levels, is pretty impossible with the insulin that's available. So, smaller amounts of carbohydrates spread throughout the day will get you that better postprandial outcome. So think about definitely using the hypo treatment and maybe avoiding slowly absorbed meal for the pregnancy and going back to it afterwards. I'm going to hand back to Sara to take us through the different stages of pregnancy.
Great, thanks, Candice. So let's go through the different stages of pregnancy and how best to optimize the settings and utilize the app for the best outcomes. So first of all, planning pregnancy. So you guys will working in pregnancy will know all this in any case. So obviously before stopping contraception, we're aiming for an A1C of 48 millimoles per mole or less, so 6.5% or less. All the things you would normally do around medication, kidney, eye check, folic acid. And we would suggest starting CamAPS FX pre-pregnancy, and the guidelines now are that it can be started and funded for the pre-pregnant population if you're identifying them early enough. And at that point, we're just aiming for the standard time in range 3.9 to 10. In the first trimester, obviously, Candice has already spoken a little bit about there's increased hypo risks. Women might be struggling a little bit more with sickness. If women haven't managed to start the system pre-pregnancy, then we would just encourage them to get on it as soon as possible. There's no need to wait, just as soon as it's possible to get going. When it comes to bolus timing in the first trimester, just aiming for the standard 10 to 15 minutes prior to eating. And at this point, because it's the hypo risks are slightly higher, we tend to go for a small adjustment in that default personal glucose target. Do you remember Candice said if it doesn't get changed, it just defaults to the 5.8, and we would encourage you to just drop it initially in the first trimester to 5.5. And at this point, also to be setting those the target ranges. So in the statistics menu, you can change and you can put the target range that the system's aiming for 3.5 to 7.8, those pregnancy time in target range. And it's just worth noting, we often see people kind of getting caught out by that, merrily going along thinking that they're doing a marvelous job getting really high percent in the target range. But actually, when you look the target range, and this is from our PDF, looking and seeing that actually in this situation, it's still on the top right corner, 3.9 to 10. And it's just worth pointing out, because I think I never really even appreciated what a big difference it makes in comparison to the actual time and range targets for pregnancy. So if someone is achieving the non-pregnancy time and range on the right-hand side at 70%, which is obviously what we're after for the general population, that only actually equates to a 45% time in the pregnancy target range. So it's huge. It makes an enormous difference. And we see occasionally we see people popping up and they haven't amended that either on the app itself or in Gluco if they're looking on Gluco data, and then they're kind of thinking everything's great when actually it's not optimized at all. Looking forward to the second and third trimester, so bolus timing might need to be slightly earlier, but really be led by what you're seeing, looking at those, looking at the data that Candice was showing you in terms of what happens to the glucose and the insulin delivery, the algorithm insulin delivery following a meal. We certainly don't generally find the need to really increase the time out vastly. Like we used to say, you know, in the first trimester, 10 to 15 minutes, and the second, it might be 15 to kind of 20 to even half an hour, and in third trimester, even longer than that. We don't generally, for most women, we didn't certainly in the studies feel the need to do that, but they're obviously everyone's individual. And if you're seeing the need to, some people might need to move it slightly earlier. Adjusting those insulin carb ratios as the insulin requirements creep up, you'll be doing that as you're looking at the data regularly in any case. Carbohydrate portion management, obviously, as the pregnancy progresses and the insulin resistance gets more marked, then sometimes we're needing to kind of moderate the amount of carbohydrate that's taken at meal times. Even sometimes going for kind of protein only breakfast, so supporting women with ideas for that and snacks that will be kind of low carb, higher protein, so that they're not feeling hungry and they're managing that situation. And in the second and third trimester, we pop the target down, the glucose target down to 5. And sometimes actually, if insulin variability is low, and particularly we know it's obviously easiest to manage overnight when people aren't moving around too much, aren't eating. For some women, if the variability was low and we wanted to even tighten things up further and get sort of the most bang for our buck, then we'd go for 4.5 in that overnight period. So sort of setting it somewhere post evening meal time to really help the algorithm drive down that post evening meal glucose level right through to waking up time at 4.5. Candice talked about the use of boost and ease off and saying kind of they're for special occasions. We don't want to overuse them. When it comes to pregnancy, we use boost as and when it's needed. We're much more proactive with the use of boost. The real thing we want to achieve is to keep that glucose level below 7.8 millimoles per litre post-meal. And so we encourage women to be super proactive when it comes to the use of boost. Just boost, put it on if you need it. Even if you're in the target range still and you can see you've got up arrows and you think, yeah, I'm not going to stay below 7.8, or I'm unlikely to, pop it on. We sometimes see people putting boost on for like really short periods of time, kind of like half an hour or so, for even 15 minutes. It's not going to do anything in that period of time if you think about the action of the insulin. So just pop it on for 2 hours at once. You can always cancel it if you think you don't need it on anymore. But the great thing about boost, just to remind you, is that it only boosts if it needs to. So if you've got boost, someone's got boost programmed for say 2 hours, 4 hours, but the system predicts that the glucose level is going to be at target level within a certain period of time, it will stop boosting. It will even take insulin delivery down to 0 if it thinks it needs to when boost is on, and then if it creeps back up again, it will start boosting again. So it's a super safe way to manage, and it really helped women, especially in that third trimester when insulin resistance is really marked, in really keeping below that 7.8 millimole mark. We also found it quite helpful if women were really resistant, like breakfast, pre-breakfast phase when they've first woken up, they can preset booster come on kind of early hours of the morning, say from 4 a.m. So that when they're waking up, they're in really great shape glucose wise to manage breakfast as sort of neatly as possible, keeping within those targets. Boost also really useful, came into its own when it came to steroid use. So if women came in to hospital for steroids pre-delivery, Boost worked really well there, alongside actually giving about a 50% extra dose with the bolus. So we kind of experimented a little bit and kind of were cautious to start off with 10% extra, 20% extra. Generally, the women that go onto steroids need about half again of their bolus when they're on those steroids. So both of those things, Boost and extra, added for the bolus. And then obviously corrections are more commonly used. Women are encouraged to be really proactive. And so just making, that's when those bolus calculator settings come into play. So in the same way as you're adjusting the carb ratios and the basal settings as insulin requirements increase, don't forget to adjust the sensitivity as well. And then when it comes to planning for delivery, we were proactively programming a second pump basal pattern. So ideally, if you knew the pre-pregnancy basal rates, just pop those back in. If not, then just a flat rate basal of about 25% of the current third trimester total daily dose will give you kind of something safe for when the baby's delivered and the insulin requirements plummet. They will have switched over to something. Again, hopefully not required, because in auto mode, the system will be doing its thing. But if the system came out of auto mode for whatever reason, there was a connectivity problem, whatever, it would be go back to pre-programmed pump basal rate at a lower, safer level for post-delivery. And then we obviously discuss all of these post-delivery changes to the bolus calculator settings with the woman and hopefully their partner, who often, or their birth partner, often given the task of being responsible for adjusting those settings. Many hospitals we know have sort of a pro forma that they put a copy into the patient's medical notes, and they've gone through those with the lady themselves. And so even if the staff on the ward aren't familiar particularly with the system, and they don't know how to change those settings for the person, which would be really unlikely, they at least know to prompt and say, have you changed your settings post delivery? And we encourage those to be changed straight away as soon as the baby's delivered. So if in terms of insulin carb ratios, if the pre-pregnancy ones were known and remembered, then they can be programmed. Otherwise, just between 12 and 15 grams. It's just something to start off with that's safe, and then you can work from there. We also need to amend the glucose target for corrections, just to be a bit less tight. The correction factor and the active insulin time, because all those things come into account when it's just for corrections, although the algorithm doesn't take them into account at the time. And you might also want to reduce down the max bolus in the pump for safety. And then through labour and delivery, we've seen many times the system being successfully used during delivery. It gives women much greater freedom than having to obviously revert to variable rate insulin infusion. The use of ease off and boosters required during delivery is absolutely fine. If there's a planned C-section, then the CamAPS FX system can be used in agreement with the obstetric and obstetric team and the anaesthetist. We generally don't see any issues with that now. People are familiar with it. If diathermy is obviously being used, then Dexcom is not licensed for use in diathermy, so just check sensor accuracy. If you think the sensor is inaccurate, stop closed loop and then restart when you're happy with the accuracy, either if the sensor's changed or it's calibrated. And then obvious things about encouraging just having that conversation when you talk about settings with the women to make sure devices are placed outside of the surgical field, and make sure they've got spare kit with them in terms of sensors and infusion sets. And then post-delivery, we say that there's no insulin required for that first meal post-delivery, that tea and toast, whatever, just don't need it. There's usually plenty of insulin hanging around. Obviously, this is when we're encouraging women to switch to those planned pre-programmed basal settings for post-delivery, changing those bolus calculator settings, increasing the personal glucose target back up. So from those tighter pregnancy targets, you can go kind of a bit higher. Don't need to go super high. It's absolutely fine to go kind of 6.5. Consider using ease off for the first few days, especially breastfeeding. They can just run ease off for as long as they want to. Just keep putting it back on if they're worried about hypoglycemia, and adjusting the weight, the body weight, and the time in range in the statistics menu back up to that 3.9 to 10, because obviously they don't need to aim so tight. And both putting the personal glucose target up and adjusting the body weight, even though the algorithm's been used to delivering really big amounts of insulin just before delivery, it very, very quickly adapts with those changes to drop down and meet those new insulin requirements. And then just a word about breastfeeding. So obvious things, easy access to hypo treatment and snacks while feeding. Often drizzling in carbohydrate works really well. It's almost like treated like in the same way as exercise in a way. Consider using ease off. And then reviewing the insulin carb ratios and the personal glucose target if hypos are a particular problem, just the standard optimization around there if needed. And then Candice can go through some case studies to help us look at some of the ways to optimize some of these things.
Thanks, Sara. So if we look at, I've just sort of got two examples of case studies just to look at the data, one from a glucose point of view and one from the PDF point of view. This is a lady who was started quite late in her pregnancy with CamAPS. She's an existing pump user and travels a lot. Her husband travels a lot, so she's at home with a toddler and very, very anxious about hypos. And so this is the PDF report. So you can see the time in range here. So she's 61% time in pregnancy range. So we're not quite getting there. There's no obvious hypo burden, but a sort of a hyperglycemia burden. So you can see the AGP at the bottom. Sorry, I went too quickly. AGP at the bottom and the splits between what the bolus is doing and what the algorithm is doing over the day. So looking at sort of why aren't we achieving this sort of 70+% time in closed loop. So let's look at this data together. So just orientate you, there's our time in range in green. You can see the alarm burden with the sensor data. Here's a sort of breakfast bolus. The bar is bigger depending on the size of the bolus. Here's a smaller bolus and the other meals. This is boost used here, ease off used down over here. And you can see she's had a huge amount of hypo sort of alarm burden. And when we discussed with her, we noticed that she'd set her alarm at 5 for hypoglycemia, which is exactly the target the algorithm was aiming for. So unfortunately, the alarm was driving her to wake up at night and hypo-treat and eat through the night, which is causing some of the disturbances. So I quite find it nice to see sort of how much alarm burden you can get from the PDF report, so you can see what's happening. So at night, she's feeding and putting ease off on when it may not be necessary. So we need to really support her address this worry, and maybe we might need to increase the personal glucose target a little bit higher and compromise maybe 5.2 and see if she's willing to put the alarm down to 4.5 or something, just so that she's not necessarily woken up as much and triggered to hypertreat. Here's a really good example of the bolus going in, the algorithm shutting off, and then starting to respond, and she's having to use boost. So if we're seeing this pattern all the time, we would be thinking, do we actually need to pull back? You can see here the next day breakfast, the algorithm is sort of dropping that. Actually, we've gone too aggressive on the insulin to carbohydrate ratio, and that might support better sort of balance between what the bolus is doing and what the algorithm is doing. putting on boost sort of for an hour when she's high, but maybe we need to encourage her, if we can, be more proactive and put on boost at an earlier stage before she's got above the 7.8 mark, rather than after that. Fat would be quite helpful. And see here again, the algorithm is shutting off. There's a mismatch. She's eaten, this bolus is a little bit late, and so forth. So this would be an example of just trying to get the bolus in on time. And then obviously, as you well know, type 1 diabetes is not only about the insulin, it's a hard condition to manage. It comes in the widest circumference of who they are. Are they working? Are they busy? What is the best sort of treatment for them? And it may be not sticking to the 5 throughout the day for her and putting it slightly higher to compromise, so she can gain a little bit more trust in this system. I think because she came to the system so late in her pregnancy, it was right where it's quite tricky, that learning about the system and how to trust it is often really hard, and we need to support people through that. So you can see here she's doing set changes and really struggling with getting that right bolus at the right time. But if we can reduce that, and also just trying to keep away from these very large carbohydrate meals. At this stage, we often try not go over probably about 60 grams, if we can have less than that, but not starving people. It's little, and often throughout the day people need a sort of a decent amount of carbohydrate, but not all in one go. The next one we wanted to show you is somebody who is now in late pregnancy, started directly from MDI in early pregnancy, has a busy job, had quite severe gastroparesis before falling pregnant, and is just about to start her C-section. You can see here, this is from glucose, just to give you sort of time in range. We're doing nicely flat, but we're starting to sort of rise towards the evening. You can see the basal bolus bit, and auto mode on for a good period of time. If people are less than sort of, we would say 90% time in closed loop, that would indicate that there's technical issues. We would expect 95 or thereabouts time in closed loop. We know the more they're in closed loop, the better the algorithm can work. And so we need to troubleshoot. So contacting customer care if there are issues with connectivity, with any issues, that they can be supported to really have a high time in closed loop. So you can see here that just a reminder, it's these two settings we are optimizing: the insulin to carb ratio and the personal glucose target. You can see the personal glucose target during the day is set at 5.2, which is slightly, again, higher than what we would recommend in late pregnancy, but she was still working and still driving with a young child. So she chose the 5.2 mark to be 5 and above for driving reasons. And then next week, when she stops driving to work and back, it was coming down to the 5 mark. And you can see she's got a nice sort of low glucose, personal glucose target from sort of after the evening meal till morning. And you can set the personal glucose target, as many as you want by the clock in the app itself. So I quite like putting day on day together, because it's artificial the way glucose gives you the data going from midnight to midnight, because obviously what happened the day before is really in connection to what's happening. And you saw on the AGP that she had that slight excursions going into the evening and overnight, even though her personal glucose target is down to the 4.5. And so if we look here, we can see that her bolus goes in. It's quite a large bolus for 70 grams of carbs, and you can see the algorithm has shut off again afterwards. And then she's risen after that point with a correction and boost to sort of bring her back down again. And so it's kind of looking at these things. One, is it the volume of carbs. She's gone over that, there's quite a big bolus, quite a lot of carbohydrate, and maybe the ratio is right if it was 50 grams of carbs rather than the 70 grams of carbs. And she maybe could have split that into 2 meals if that is possible, to be able to look. Or is it actually we've gone a bit aggressive on that insulin to carb ratio throughout the day? And you can see she's getting away with sort of the 60 grams of carbs after breakfast, but that probably is not as good as 35 and 40 like she split the day before around sort of the lunchtime mark. In the evening here, you can see a different excursion to here. The algorithm has actually not been able to save the hypo. So this example on this day is actually giving us a better indication that probably that insulin to carbohydrate ratio might be a little bit on the strong side, and we need to take that down. And then the 13 grams of hypo treatment that she's used probably is a little bit on the greater side, and maybe 10 grams, so she didn't bounce up to the top of the target. But I mean, we're fine-tuning perfection here, just looking for those signs of when is the ratio too strong, when is the ratio too weak, and are there signs of sort of that pump maintenance that we need to be so careful about. We think very sophisticated algorithm, but if people are forgetting to bolus, or they're forgetting to do regular set changes with the right cannulas, and encouraging our women as the pregnancy progresses to do more set changes so that the insulin absorption and delivery is as equal as possible, is really helpful throughout the pregnancy. Sophisticated algorithm, but it's not going to help if the set isn't working well. Right, so we are going to just summarize quickly, and then we are going to take some questions. I see the questions have been flowing through. If you have anything that you haven't asked yet, please pop it in the Q&A. But we've just had a brief run through the settings and given you a background into the system and the features, the personalization, what you can optimize, personal glucose target, and the ICR as the pregnancy progresses, using boost and ease off when you need to, much more proactive on boost during pregnancy, the differences between the trimesters, and sort of looking at some optimization data. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so my fellow presenters can join. Will, please join us when you're ready. And Will, I've got a first question aimed at you. The Dana, is it on the supply chain? You're on.
Yep, the answer is yes, it is. Sorry.
Okay, brilliant, no problem. So it's on the supply chain. People can get that information as they normally would for the other pumps. Fantastic. Okay, Sara, I'm going to ask this for this of you. There's some questions that we've been asked about the basal rate. So how often would you review the basal rate in pregnancy? The pump basal rate in pregnancy?
Yep. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for the questions. Every month is fine. Kind of every other clinic appointment if they're coming a couple of times a month to start off with. If requirements are really shooting up towards the end, you might want to tweak it every couple of weeks right towards the end. But yeah, just once a month is fine. Just looking in the way Candice said, looking at the total daily dose, and just using that as a guide if you want to, or just tweaking it up depending on how things are going. Sometimes you can see if a woman has come out of auto mode for a period of time, like lost connection overnight or something, or during the 2-hour periods where there's sense of warm up, and you can see if the glucose is rising. You can give it a tweak at those times if you want to, but otherwise just base it on the total daily dose. Is there a risk in relation?
Sick day rules. So how would we use, because that's something we haven't covered, just focusing on the pregnancy. Do you want to cover sick day rules?
Yeah, sure. So sick day rules, in terms of sick day rules for pregnancy, same deal as with hybrid closed loop therapy generally. If there is ketones, I know we're really super careful in pregnancy with ketones anyway. If there's ketones, then take the system out of auto mode. It's not designed to deliver the amounts of insulin that might be required if someone's unwell and ketotic, and just follow normal pump sick day rules. So yeah, for sure, if you're using like 200% temporary basal rates and you've not optimized the basal, then it's not going to give you enough. So it is important that they're optimized. And there's a third part to that question, isn't there? Could the system automatically optimize the programmed basal rate? That would be amazing, and it's certainly something that we've talked about. We'd like to see that in the future. I think it would be really difficult to kind of nuance the basal in the way we used to kind of pre-automated insulin delivery, when we used to kind of be tweaking different periods of the time of day and thinking we were doing a marvelous job that was probably not making a too much difference, unfortunately. But yeah, because the whole point is we need closed loop, because things are so variable, and people need very different amounts sometimes on the same person two nights in a row, so it's tricky. But we have been speaking about in the future whether there be the possibility of building something like that into the system so it automatically updates. So yeah, watch this space, but not in the very near future.
Thanks. There's a question about what's the recommended amount of insulin to carbohydrate ratio, and I think that's impossible to answer because everyone has a different requirement. So you would just start where you've done your calculations and then just optimize as you normally would, based on looking at focusing on the algorithm. What's the algorithm telling you? If the bolus is going in at the right time, is the algorithm shutting off after every meal, or really ramping up after every meal? Gives you that sort of clinical information. Maybe we need to increase it by whatever percentage, and just seeing what happens from there.
It's just a good point, I think, to add in at this point as well. So during the ATUK study, we started both women. We took women who were already on pumps, but we also, I think, about half the women were on MDI, and we just did the standard calculations, pump start calculations that you would generally do. Just got them everything kind of there and thereabouts, like you would do with a standard pump start, and we went straight on to closed loop. We didn't wait. And the women managed really well. We didn't have any issues with it kind of being too much information, or all those sorts of things. It worked brilliantly. And one of the things you see from the data from the ATUK study is not only the overall massive improvement in time in range, but actually how quickly the system gets on top. So even within the first 3 or 4 days after starting, there's already a marked improvement in that time in range. So the sooner you can get women onto the system and going into auto mode, the better. So just start straight away. There's no need to wait.
I think that's really important. I've often had pushback, or people worrying, I don't want to start a new therapy in the first trimester. Let's wait for the second or third. I think the evidence is there to show you really need to start as early as possible. Ideally pre-pregnancy, but if the woman arrives pregnant, please don't wait. Just start as soon as that person and you are practically ready. There have been a few questions about settings, like the correction factor and active insulin time, settings that are in the bolus calculator. Sara, do you mind just going over that again, around what they do and why they are there?
Yeah. So essentially, the algorithm isn't interested in any of those settings when it's working. It calculates based on that total daily dose and weight. It calculates its own insulin sensitivity for that person at different times of day, and it learns and adjusts it as required. And it doesn't take, although it doesn't take any information from the carb ratio itself, it obviously is looking to see what happens after an insulin bolus, and we know that the carb ratios is one of the things we need to optimize as well. Where those settings are really important is in open loop. So if someone is using the bolus calculator outside of auto mode, then it will take into account that correction factor, the active insulin time, and so that sensitivity. Or if someone is in auto mode but gives a manual correction, which you can do, and the thing again to remind you is, no one should be entering fake carbs with this system. There's no need to jimmy the system, enter fake carbs. In fact, it's detrimental actually, because the way the system takes into account carbohydrate on board. And so if someone has a reason to give, we obviously say give manual corrections on top of everything that algorithm's doing with caution. But if someone's had a set failure or has really miscounted their dose with a meal or whatever, and they want to add a cautious correction, they don't need to put fake carbs in. They can just go to the bolus calculator. They can use the current glucose level if they want to by just touching it. It asks you to confirm it, and then it turns blue, and then it will give a correction dose based on those bolus calculator settings. So the sensitivity that's in there, the correction factor sensitivity, the active insulin time, and the target in the bolus calculator, it will use that rather than the personal glucose target in that situation. And at that point, they can see their dose, and then when they press to deliver and it comes up, their dose comes up on the next page, they've still got control over adjusting it just by tapping it, and it barrel rolls up or down depending on what they want to do. So they have complete control. The person has complete control. There's no need to enter fake carbs, but I think sometimes people forget because it's not something they do regularly. And we often see if someone's been having a bit of trouble, and we're looking at the graphs and charts, and we can see it's odd. Every time someone's high, there's kind of a 20 grams goes in, and then you question and say, did you actually eat that 20 grams? And they often will tell you, oh no, I couldn't remember how to correct, so I was just making the system give me extra insulin. And just you can then recap that with them, because there's absolutely no need. And like I said, it's actually detrimental. It's not going to work as well because it's taking into account carbohydrate on board.
Thanks, Sara. There was a question about, the time in range is 3.9 to 10 outside pregnancy and 3.5 to 7.8 inside pregnancy. And is it essential to change it back after the birth?
I think one of the things that I mean, it's not essential, but we don't want to put the pressure on that new mother to really be driving super tight time in range. There's no need. We're back to outside of pregnancy. The consensus guidelines are that aiming for a target of 3.9 to 10 gives optimal glucose control for good health. So I think not changing it can make the women potentially feel like they're doing worse than they are, and it can probably give a higher risk for hypoglycemia if they're sort of aiming to drive down to that at a time when things, their bodies change massively. They're managing a new baby with the lack of sleep, breastfeeding, maybe still running around after other children and everything else. So we just want to kind of take the pressure off. I think one of the things is not be published anytime soon, and to look out for is after the ATUK study we did, we studied the majority of the women postpartum for 6 months, and we're just about to publish that data, so I can't share exactly what it is, but the long and the short of it is it's fantastic, the postpartum data. So women just stayed on the system after pregnancy, just kind of let it carry on doing its own thing, still living their life, bolusing hopefully for carbohydrate when they had it, but otherwise just carried on. And I think going back to certainly when I was working clinically, we do a brilliant job of managing these women during pregnancy, even with the tools we had before hybrid closed loop. And then, they deliver their baby. We might see them, on the delivery unit and say hi and meet their baby. And then we wouldn't see them often until sort of 6 months later. And I know I always felt it was, I sort of felt really aggrieved that I'd done a bad job when they rocked up 6 months later, and their A1C shot back up, and things had kind of really sort of become way more suboptimal in terms of control, completely understandably because of everything they're managing to deal with. And I think what was so exciting about the postpartum data is almost better than the ATUK study data itself, is that women came back 6 months later with phenomenal control. And what we're seeing now is many of the women that were in the study and have been on the system since then coming back for a later pregnancy, and they're already in an amazing place to start at conception, which hopefully will have all those impacts that we want to see, positive impacts on the developing fetus, because they'll have had really superb control right from conception, which is just fantastic.
No, absolutely. And there's a sort of a similar question that if you've got someone who's in a third trimester with, erratic management, is it worth starting then? And certainly from my experiences is yes, start it, but start it as soon as you possibly can for the best outcomes. Don't delay. It's too late. Any difference will make a difference, but ideally the earlier the better. So there is a question, which is a very clinical question, thanks Ellie, about if somebody's got a high DKA risk, would you add sort of subcut basal insulin to support the pump, just in case they're not as responsive as you ideally would want them to be? What's your take? And then I'll add mine maybe.
I think it's absolutely fine to do that. I think in the same way, you know, outside of pregnancy, to have that kind of, you know, you've got someone that you want to put on pump therapy and you're just concerned that, you know, they're prone to DKA, they're, you know, more likely to maybe not be so responsive as we might like, and, you know, tip into DKA more easily or whatever, then yeah, a small amount of long acting basal is absolutely fine, and the system will manage it. Obviously it's going to be easier for the system if they do take it regularly, but even if they kind of miss one day, it's constantly reacting to the glucose level, so, and which, you know, are going to be variable anyway, so it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to affect the algorithm. It will be fine. The algorithm can cope with that.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. I think ketones are really bad for baby and for mom. So, you know, anything we can support anybody manage where they are in that moment to get the best pregnancy outcomes, I think we need to certainly do that.
It's just the dose. I think it's just being careful with the dose, and remembering then that, you know, the algorithm at some point sometimes backs off to zero, but when it's backed off to zero, potentially you've still got some basal insulin hanging around. So I guess having a conversation with the person that just kind of, you know, keep an eye, and they may need, you know, whereas someone without that preset, without that extra basal layer in there might not need any hypo treatment and be very happy that they're just going to skim that low level when the algorithm switches off. Then someone else might need to, you know, have a couple of grams of carbs just to help as well with that. But otherwise, I think the benefits of having it in someone that you're really concerned about would outweigh the risks, I think.
Absolutely. How are we doing? We're doing great for time. So lots of questions. We'll try and get through all of them. There's a question that I think is very relevant, because NHS England have now launched a sort of a switch program that if people are on another system and choose to switch to CamAPS for pregnancy, who wants to speak to that? And you know, what you know, how does the funding application work?
Do you want to take that, Will, or?
It seems to be a mixed message. Some ICBs say they don't know about it. Some say they do. There's a bit of a postcode lottery around that. But I heard, I think it was £1 million was this separate pot of money. Should someone be on a system not licensed in pregnancy, they can be swapped over to CamAPS. But beyond that, I don't know how the funding is actually applied for.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not entirely sure how it's applied for. So it might be something that we need to find out and share with people when we send certificates out, potentially, if we can find the answer to that.
Certainly, the full information is in the previous CDEP webinar that we did with NHS England. If you look for the information on the CDEP website, there is information on there about how it's applied for. It will be different in certain locations depending on if you're in England. We have some people from Wales or Scotland. So this is the swapping fund is for NHS England, but that information, do watch out for NHS England's sort of rotating. They're going to start a lot of sort of a rotating program of making it more available, but it's certainly that switch fund is available for people. Just find out what's happening in your locality. And then there was another question about pregnancy leaflets and things. There is a lot on the CamDiab website. Also, the distributors of the systems that have information for you. So just reach out to customer care to get that information. But there is also on the CamDiab website. There's quite a few questions about, is it safe? You know, should we start? When should we start in pregnancy? I think the key is start it as soon as possible. And if you have any questions or wanting, you know, to pick brains, please do reach out to us. We're happy to kind of think through aspects or share our information if you do have a complex case. But as you see from that one case, this woman with gastroparesis actually incredibly improved dramatically during the pregnancy, that she was able to eat better. So just the tight control for her and for the baby was really, really important. Any recommendations, Sara, on cannula for pregnancy and then around delivery? We've got a few questions about cannula choice.
I think whichever cannula, if someone's been on a cannula before, then just usually stick with the type of cannula that they had before, if that that works for them. I'm kind of really pro steel cannulas generally up until the point of delivery. So I think, and I think someone had put something in the chat that some hospitals, say no steel cannulas for delivery, which kind of makes sense. But outside of that, then steel cannulas, obviously, you're going to generally rule out one of those potential kind of set problem issues. So I think steel cannulas are really useful. As in the UK, we're still not kind of great at pushing them. I don't know why people don't kind of worry about them a little bit more potentially. Yeah, exactly. There's other countries that we work in think we're absolutely crazy because a lot of other countries don't use Teflon cannulas hardly at all. So yeah, essentially whichever cannula works to start with, and then so just pick whatever. I'd go steel if the woman's happy to. If they don't want to, I have to just get people to try
change,
one. Yeah, just try one steel cannula, because often people will think it's going to feel like it's poking them all the time, and of course once they pop one in, they realize it's really fine. But yeah, so if they'll try, great. If not, fine. Teflon cannula is fine, and Teflon for delivery, I think some people recommend. So.
There's also a question about why we try to spread the carbohydrate throughout the day and sort of say, 60 or so, or maybe less in later pregnancy is sort of a cap. Can you cover that as well? Why that is the case?
So with the insulin resistance as it builds during pregnancy, all those hormones that a placenta's producing, women just become very insulin resistant, and we're aiming for really tight glucose control, keeping that glucose level between that sort of below that magic 7.8 millimoles per litre. And essentially, the insulin just doesn't work quickly enough to allow someone to have a really massive quantity of carbohydrate, or even sometimes actually not even a really massive, actually even quite sort of a meager amount of carbohydrate, and not manage to stay below that 7.8. So just to try and give people the best chance of hitting that as possible, just that's why we tend to sort of be a bit more rigorous in capping both the quantity and the quality of the carbohydrate. So really trying to get people to think about the type of carbohydrate, going for more slowly absorbed choices if they're willing to, as well as kind of spreading it out. We're not suggesting people should be kind of hungry or not eating enough calories, and certainly not having low amounts of carbohydrate. Definitely aiming for kind of around 120 grams a day as a minimum for kind of good nutrition, but yeah, just sometimes spreading out. And if people are hungry and they're wanting to eat more, or they kind of can't manage to have carbs at breakfast in the third trimester, but actually they can have a sort of more higher protein breakfast, but then actually kind of a bit later in the morning they can get away with a snack with some carbs in there, kind of just supporting women to manage that best they can, and that's going to give them the best chance of keeping below that 7.8 top end of the target.
No, absolutely. Just the insulin companies haven't made a fast enough insulin at this stage, but maybe one will come in the near future. There was also a question about why we were looking at the basal bolus split in when we're looking at gluco, or we're looking at the PDF report. That often gives you a clue as to, if somebody isn't maybe bolusing, that they're skipping meals, and the algorithm is doing too much of the work for them eating if you're not getting your time in range. If you're getting your time in range without the highs and lows, it doesn't matter about the basal bolus split. But if, like that one graph that I showed you, that only 14% of the insulin was coming from the bolus, and the vast majority was from the algorithm, and they were only having 28 grams of carbs a day, for example, they're obvious. If that's true, we need to support them around their nutrition. But if that isn't, then we maybe need to support them about how we can support them around bolusing for the carbohydrate they're eating to get that time in range. So I think the split kind of helps you as part of the wider clinical picture, thinking, if we're not getting that clinical outcome of 70% time in range, what lever do we need to tweak? And changing a ratio, if somebody's not bolusing, is not going to help. Changing the personal glucose target is probably as low as it really is. So it's supporting that behavioral element, which is so tricky. We ask a lot of our women, and so we do need to acknowledge that it's not always possible. And so I always use the term fine-tuning perfection, because I know they're really trying really hard to the best of their ability, and we're there to support them. Now, let's see. I think actually we've covered most of them. I'm just trying to look down the line. I don't know if is it Will or Sara, if there's anything jumping out at you
I
that
was
we
just
haven't
looking.
kind of covered.
There was a question about changing the active insulin time. Just in terms of the algorithm, that for this system, the active insulin time doesn't make any difference. I know for other systems like Medtronic, it does. For this, it doesn't make any difference other than if you're giving corrections. So you're giving manual corrections, the system takes into account the active insulin time then. So that's but the algorithm driven insulin isn't looking at the active insulin time at all, just to be clear. So we don't tend to change it particularly. We just leave it on whatever you've set it to as standard. It doesn't tend to make much difference. If you're needing to give lots of corrections, then you might want to make it slightly shorter if you feel it's not giving the amount of insulin at that. But then if you're needing to give lots of corrections, then there's probably another issue in any case that needs managing. And maybe I confuse someone, it's because there's a question saying Sara's mentioned about increasing the insulin sensitivity factor for corrections, but I thought the algorithm didn't take this into account. It doesn't, but just if you're correcting manually on top, it does. So just to make that super clear.
Yeah, I spotted one. How do you change the personal glucose target overnight? So in the way in the app, you set your personal glucose target, you choose your start and your end time. And so if you wanted to have between 6 and 6 p.m. you wanted a certain target, you just set 6 and 6 and the value you wanted there. It defaults to the 5.8 for the others, and then you can just tap and change that, or you can just put in a different start and finish time. So you can optimize this and have as many different start and end times as you think is clinically appropriate for that.
Candice, could I just say that as there was a sort of sizable discussion there around cannulas, I didn't mention anything about that in my presentation. Just to say, as well as having 2 Teflon, we do have 2 steel cannula options as well, if that's something that people are interested in. So we have 2 steel cannulas.
And just remind us what the size of those steel cannulas are.
Well, the shortest one, it's manually inserted. It's 4.5 millimeters. It's the shortest available. And I've found that one of the benefits, because it has a little 10-centimeter tail on it, it allows the patients to access areas they couldn't maybe reach previously, because for disconnecting and reconnecting, it's got that little bit of an extension. The other one's 5.5 millimeters long as well. So 4.5 and 5.5.
And well, do you allow people to have a range of, maybe they might want steel and Teflon, to try one of each and see? Is that something you offer to be able to send out to people?
Yeah, that would be fine. Samples would be fine. I know it's a personal thing, so if they wanted to try it, they don't have to order a box. So can send out some samples. That's no problem.
No, that's absolutely great. So you'll notice there's a poll on our screen. So please fill that in. It'll be lovely to get some feedback from you. And then when you leave the webinar, you'll see there's also a little survey that you can provide us some feedback. And if there's any outstanding information or any other support you need, you can fill it in there with your email address, and we can get back to you to provide that information or support that you require. But I'm going to bring it to a close and thank you, Will and ATUK, for sponsoring this webinar. I think it's been a fantastic and well received. Thank you, Sara, for coming alongside me and helping me present. That was absolutely fabulous. And thank you to everyone out there who gave up their lunch break to come and listen to us. The certificates, slide deck and where the recording is going to be hosted will be sent to you in the next couple of days. So don't worry, you will be receiving it so you can watch back and get all the information again. So thank you very much to everyone for your time and attention. Thank you for all those claps. Lovely to see them across the bottom of the screen, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks once again to ATUK and the speakers.
Thanks,
Thank
Candice.
you. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.